We are at the midpoint of the Women's FIDE Candidates 2026, and the race for the top could not be tighter. Jiner and Vishali Rameshbabu are locked together at 5.5 points each, with Anna Muzichuk just half a point behind. Every game from here is a battle for the candidate's title. In round 9, Ju faces Kateryna Lagno with white, a game that could separate the leaders or tighten the chase even further. Buckle up. Jiner, the sharp and resourceful Chinese Grandmaster, enters this game as co-leader and cannot afford to slip. Her opponent, Kateryna Lagno, is a seasoned Ukrainian player known for her solid positional understanding. Lagno trails by 1.5 points and needs a win to stay relevant in this candidate's race. This is a game where ambition meets necessity, on both sides. The Zukatort opening, beginning with knight to f3, is a flexible system championed by players like Vladimir Kramnik and Magnus Carlsen. Rather than committing the center immediately, white keeps options open and lets black reveal their hand first. It often transposes into Queen's Gambit or English structures, and the key strategic theme is control of the center from a distance while developing harmoniously. Knight to f3 is the Zukatort move order, one of the most flexible first moves available to white. By developing the knight immediately, white controls the e5 square and delays any central commitment, waiting to see how black responds before choosing a pawn structure. Black stakes a claim in the center immediately with d5, the most direct and principled response. Lagno signals her intention to fight for central space and likely steer the game into Queen's Gambit-style territory, a quiet but purposeful move, supporting a future d4 push while keeping the pawn structure solid. White is in no rush, preferring to build a stable foundation before committing to any central action. Black mirrors white's development with knight to f6, a natural and harmonious response. The knight targets the center and prepares to coordinate with the dark-squared bishop. White reveals the Nimzo-English or London-adjacent intent with b3, preparing to fianchetto the light-squared bishop to b2. This bishop will exert long-range pressure along the long diagonal, eyeing the center from a distance. Black challenges the center with c5, a classic Nimzo-Indian-style counter. This move fights for central space and prepares to develop the queenside pieces actively. The bishop arrives on b2 as planned, completing the fianchetto and aiming directly at the long diagonal toward g7 and beyond. This is the Zukatort system's most important piece, controlling the center from the flank. Black reinforces the d5 pawn and opens the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. This is a solid, classical approach that prioritizes structural integrity over immediate activity. White tucks the light-squared bishop to e2, completing development quietly and preparing to castle kingside. The setup is modest but deeply solid, and white will look to strike in the center with d4 soon. The knight comes to c6, adding pressure to the d4 square and coordinating the queenside forces. Black is building a classical setup that mirrors many Queen's Gambit decline structures. White castles kingside, tucking the king to safety and connecting the rooks. With development nearly complete, the stage is set for the central battle to begin in earnest. Black places the bishop on d6, an active square where it eyes the kingside and supports the d5 pawn. This is a common placement in these structures, keeping pressure in the center. White finally commits to d4, the key central advance that has been prepared for several moves. This pawn now clashes with black's c5 and d5 pawns, and the position opens into genuine tension. Black plays b6, intending to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop to b7 and add pressure to the long diagonal. However, this slightly loosens black's queenside pawn structure and delays the development of coordination between the pieces. White strikes immediately with c4, opening the position and challenging black's central pawns. Now, both the c5 and d5 pawns are under pressure simultaneously. Black completes the fianchetto with bishop to b7, adding a powerful piece to the long diagonal. But notice how this natural-looking move still leaves the king uncastled, and the position is becoming increasingly sharp. White trades on d5, releasing the central tension and opening lines. This forces black to recapture and clarifies the pawn structure. Black recaptures with the e-pawn, keeping the c5 pawn alive and maintaining a central pawn mass. This recapture gives black a semi-isolated d5 pawn that could become a target later. The knight develops to c3, putting immediate pressure on the d5 pawn and completing white's minor piece development. Black must now solve the problem of the undefended d5 pawn. Lagno finally castles, bringing the king to safety, but the engine already senses a slight imbalance here, as white's pieces are actively placed and the d5 pawn remains a long-term concern. The rook swings to c1, eyeing the c-file and preparing to exploit any weaknesses on c5. White is building pressure in a very natural and consistent way. Black adds the rook to the e-file with re8, contesting the central file and preparing to activate, but this reactive move still leaves the queenside coordination slightly unresolved. A wonderful outpost move, the knight leaps to b5, threatening to land on d6 or take on d6, and eyeing the c7 square. This creates immediate practical problems for black. Black retreats the bishop to f8, the only square to avoid an immediate material loss. This is a passive but necessary concession, undoing the active development that black had invested several moves in achieving. White takes on c5, winning a pawn and forcing black to recapture. The position is simplifying, but white emerges with a structural and material edge. Black takes back with the b-pawn, which now gives black an isolated c-pawn. This pawn on c5 will become a long-term target for white as the game progresses into the endgame. White trades the bishop for the f6 knight, deliberately damaging black's kingside pawn structure. After this capture, black's king will be less sheltered and the resulting pawn structure around it weakened. Lagno recaptures with the g-pawn, the only reasonable option. This creates a doubled f-pawn situation that weakens the kingside significantly and opens the g-file near the black king. The bishop comes to d3, a powerful square where it targets the h7 pawn and coordinates with the knight on b5. White is building up pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. Black centralizes the knight on e5, a natural outpost that challenges white's activity. This is black's most active response, fighting back in the center and giving the position some practical complications. White plays the rook to e1, which the engine evaluates as a significant inaccuracy, swinging the evaluation sharply. By retreating the rook rather than pressing with a more forcing continuation, Ju allows black to reorganize and the position becomes much more balanced. The bishop on d3 and the knight on b5 were well placed, and maintaining the initiative with a more active approach would have kept the advantage. Black activates the queen to d7, connecting the rooks and eyeing the b5 knight. Lagno begins to coordinate her pieces and fight back effectively. The knight retreats from b5 to c3, a slightly passive concession. White repositions to support the center but temporarily loses the initiative. An aggressive queen sortie to g4, threatening to trade queens and reduce white's activity. Black is now playing more confidently and seeking to neutralize white's pressure. White trades the knight for the centralized black knight on e5. This simplification leads toward an endgame where white still holds a slight structural advantage. Black takes the queen on d1, forcing an endgame. Lagno decides that exchanging queens is the safest approach, reducing the material and hoping to hold the resulting position. White recaptures with the rook on e1, maintaining rook activity. The endgame begins with white holding a solid but not overwhelming advantage. Black recaptures on e5 with the f-pawn, opening the f-file and eliminating the central knight. This also gives black a passed e-pawn, which adds some counterplay. White challenges the d5 pawn immediately with e4, fighting for central space and creating a dynamic pawn battle in the center. Black captures on e4, opening the position further. However, this trade gives white's pieces easy access to the center, and the engine begins to sense a growing white advantage. The bishop recaptures on e4, a powerful centralized square. White now has an active bishop and the initiative in this rook endgame. Lagno trades off the bishop, simplifying further. But with this exchange, the remaining endgame becomes a rook versus rook battle where white's more active pieces and black's isolated c5 pawn will tell the story. The knight recaptures and plants itself powerfully on e4. White now has a knight, a rook, and an active king coming against black's rook, bishop, and the weak c5 pawn. Black moves the rook to d8, contesting the d-file and keeping the rooks active, but the isolated c5 pawn remains a chronic weakness. White activates the king immediately, a key technique in knight and rook in games. The king heads toward the center to support the knight and create additional threats. Black trades rooks with a check, trying to simplify into a more drawish ending. The exchange reduces the material, but white still retains winning chances thanks to the knight and the weak c5 pawn. White recaptures on d1. Now the position is a rook, knight, and king versus rook, bishop, and king in game, with black's c5 pawn still a long-term liability. And here Lagno plays i5, pushing the queenside pawn forward, but this turns out to be a significant mistake. The evaluation swings sharply in white's favor. The pawn advance weakens the b5 square and the i5 pawn itself becomes exposed. Sitting back and keeping the position solid with a move like rb8 or rc8 would have been more resilient, keeping the rook active without creating new weaknesses. White centralizes the rook to d5, an excellent and active square. The rook now attacks the c5 pawn directly and restricts black's king from accessing the queenside. Lagno pushes i4, trying to create a passed pawn on the queenside, but the engine considers this another inaccuracy. The pawn runs forward, but becomes disconnected from its support, and white's rook on d5 combined with the knight will soon dominate the board. Keeping the rook more active would have offered better practical resistance. White wins the e5 pawn with the rook, and now has a material advantage on top of the positional edge. Zhu is converting her advantage methodically. Black takes on b3, winning a pawn back, but the resulting position still favors white. The a-pawn has disappeared, and white's pieces remain dominant. White recaptures with the a-pawn, keeping a passed b-pawn in reserve. The position is becoming increasingly one-sided. Lagno activates the rook to b8, targeting the b3 pawn and trying to generate counterplay. This is the last serious practical try, but the engine still sees white as clearly better. White delivers a check with the rook to g5, forcing the black king to move and setting up a coordinated attack. The rook becomes even more active from g5. The king retreats to h8, forced off the g8 square by the rook check. Black's king is now tucked in the corner with limited mobility. White repositions the rook to g3, maintaining pressure while also preparing to support the b3 pawn's advance. Methodical technique from Zhu. Black plays h6, creating some breathing room for the king and preventing immediate backrank issues. But this also creates a new pawn target on h6 that white can exploit with the knight. The king marches forward to e2, continuing the king activation plan. White brings every piece into play to help convert the advantage. Black's rook moves to b4, attacking the b3 pawn and trying to tie down white's resources. This keeps the rook active and creates some practical counterplay. White retreats the knight to d2, covering the b3 pawn and preparing to regroup towards c4 or e4. Patient and precise technique. The bishop activates to d6, targeting the b4 square and the g3 rook. Lagno is trying every resource to complicate the position, but the evaluation continues to climb in white's favor. The rook shifts to d3, defending more actively and preparing to challenge along the d-file. Zhu is not rushing, keeping all options controlled. Black retreats the bishop to e5, keeping it centralized and active, but the position is becoming increasingly difficult to hold for Lagno. The knight jumps to c4, attacking the bishop on e5 and also threatening to invade on d6 or e5. White's pieces are now fully coordinated and black is running out of good moves. Lagno retreats the bishop to g7, trying to keep it safe, but this turns out to be a serious mistake. The evaluation swings by 3 full pawns. The bishop is now passively placed on g7 and the knight on c4 is free to dominate. Keeping the bishop on e5 or activating the rook would have offered much sturdier resistance. White immediately exploits the situation with knight to d6, an incredible outpost in the heart of black's position. The knight on d6 dominates the entire board, attacking the rook on b4 and eyeing the c8 and f7 squares. Black moves the king to g8, trying to bring the king closer to the action, but this proves to be another critical error. The evaluation now rockets upward by nearly 5 full pawns. The king steps onto a square where it will soon come under a rook attack, and the defensive resources are nearly exhausted. White repositions the rook to g3, threatening to exploit the weakened kingside. With the knight dominating on d6 and the rook ready to swing, black's position is crumbling. The king steps back to h7, hoping to avoid the rook on the g-file, but the evaluation remains near a decisive plus for white. Every retreat is forced, and the net is tightening. The knight captures on f7, a clean tactical blow that wins material. The fork threat on h8 and the bishop on g7 means black cannot recapture without losing material. Lagno moves the rook to b6, trying to activate and create some counterplay, but the evaluation shows white is now clearly winning with no realistic path to defense. White pushes f4, advancing the kingside pawns and creating further passed pawn potential. This adds yet another winning resource to the position. Black plays re6 with check, desperately seeking counterplay and trying to disrupt white's king. But this move only delays the inevitable, and the evaluation now stands at over 3 pawns in white's favor. White calmly blocks the check with the rook on e3. The rook is well placed here, and white has multiple winning continuations. Zhu shows no panic whatsoever. Black repositions the rook to f6, challenging the f4 pawn and keeping fighting, but the position is beyond saving, and the engine sees nearly 3 pawns in white's favor. The knight springs to d8, a brilliant redeployment that attacks the rook on f6 and threatens to invade deeper. Zhu's knight continues to dominate. Black grabs the f4 pawn with the rook, winning material but walking into a decisive losing position. The engine already considers this effectively over, with white over 3 pawns ahead in evaluation. The rook swings to e7, a powerful and active square threatening the bishop on g7 and cutting off the black king. White's pieces are working in perfect concert. Lagno retreats the rook to b4, attempting to stay active, but the position is completely lost. The evaluation is approaching 4 pawns in white's favor. The knight leaps to e6, attacking the bishop on g7 with tempo and winning yet more material. Black cannot defend all the threats simultaneously. The king tries to move to g6, stepping out of the pin and trying to escape, but the evaluation is now over 4 pawns. There is simply no way back for black at this point. The knight captures the bishop on g7, completing the material harvest. Zhu has now won the bishop for free, and the endgame is completely hopeless for black. Black takes the last pawn on b3, a desperation capture. The evaluation remains over 4 pawns in white's favor, and the game is essentially decided. The knight retreats to e8, dominating the entire board and threatening to shepherd a passed pawn forward. Black has no meaningful counterplay remaining. Lagno pushes c4, the last passed pawn attempt, but it cannot survive against white's active pieces. The evaluation climbs even higher. White delivers check with rook to g7, forcing the black king to move and winning the c4 pawn next. The technique is clean and precise. The king moves to f5, stepping into the center in desperation, but the position is completely lost, and the evaluation is nearly 4.5 pawns. White forks with knight check to d6, attacking the king and winning more material. Lagno's position collapses move by move. The king moves to f6, the only legal square, but the net is completely closed. White will mop up the remaining pawns and convert without difficulty. And with rook to c7, white seizes the c-file and threatens to pick up the c4 pawn immediately. Lagno resigns shortly after, recognizing that the position is completely hopeless. Zhu converts beautifully. This game was ultimately decided by Zhu's superior technique in the endgame. Once the knight established itself on d6 and the rook coordinated on the 7th rank, there was no way back for Lagno. The key turning points were the passive bishop retreat to g7 and the king misplacement to g8, which allowed the decisive invasion. Zhu's conversion was methodical and ruthless. Round 9 sees Jiner pull ahead at the top of the women's candidates, a critical result in what promises to be a thrilling finish to this tournament. With several rounds still to play, every half point will matter enormously. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Zhu's in-game technique, and do not forget to subscribe for full coverage of every round.